So, right, moving on to Mr. Nivard Cabraal. Mr. Cabraal, over to you to introduce in about 15 to 20 minutes your proposal, and then we'll pose some questions.
Thank you, Anushka. I think we had an interesting session from Anuruddha, and then now we got to also think as to where we are going after the COVID, or even in this period where we are grappling with COVID. Because I believe many people have begun to feel the economic tension of the COVID-19 outbreak, which means that they are now having serious difficulties as far as the economic patterns of work is concerned, and also their own lines. So I think the situation is becoming quite grave, which means that we would need to find ways and means as to how we could move out of that situation and move into the next phase where we can continue with development. The whole world is going through this difficulty. We have seen developed countries struggling with the situation. US is reporting tens of millions of people without jobs. We see some of the other countries also having acute difficulties. Even in Sri Lanka, sometimes when you pause to think that we have as many as 1.9 million people who are daily paid, they have to be also live in some way. They have to be able to live. We have got the informal sector, which is quite large in our country. The formal sector is also quite large, and those companies that are presently having difficulties also need to be nurtured through into a new phase. So it's a fairly uncharted territory which we have to think of. At the same time, this is not peculiar to us. The whole world is struggling with this situation. We have seen the IMF saying that it is a period where they are grappling with exceptional situations and problems. And they also acknowledge that it needs exceptional resolution methods, exceptional responses. That's true with Sri Lanka too. I believe now we would see a slowdown of economic activity. Our tourism is going to get badly hit, at least in a short period, maybe a year or so. Our apparel sector is taking a hit. We probably see the low demand for oil being reflected in those countries which are producing oils as a period where they would want more and more people to move out of their countries because they cannot afford them. So that means people who are working in the Middle East might need to find work back again at home here. That might mean that we may find it difficult to get remittances from there. So these are going to be shocks for our real economy, for our monetary part of our economy, the fiscal side. The government is going to struggle if it doesn't have any new ways of thinking. The banking sector can also see a large number of non-performing loans. It was increasing even up to last year, but that will probably get aggravated unless there is some way that we are going to deal with it. We would also see the external sector having a fair amount of tension taking place. So what do we do? I think many of us are beginning to feel the pinch. We know that something needs to be done. We also know that the olden day results and the olden day methods will probably not work. We got to think out of the box. We got to create demand. We got to ensure that people can have hope again, that there will be confidence in the economy. So it's a fairly tricky balance that we have to now deal with. And to do that, I've also been thinking of this quite seriously. And I think there are two things that we need to do. One is a timeout where we make sure that those companies as well as those who are in business get some space for them to think, for them to recoup and to just stay afloat. That's the important period. It's like if you are hit by a bus, you need to first of all make sure that the patient is stabilized. If he's bleeding, you got to stop the bleeding. You got to make sure that the patient is stabilized as much as possible. So it's the same way economy has been given a shock. It was already in some kind of doldrums, as you know, in the years 2015 to 2019, our per capita income just only went up by $33. So it's a very, very vulnerable patient that we have been having. So that patient, by getting this shock, is going to be also seriously affected. What do we do? So we got to first of all stabilize, make sure that there is a timeout so that they can recover. And thereafter, we got to stimulate. We got to give the treatment to make sure that the patient can come out of this situation. It's not like just a normal way that we would have a company and then plan for that company to progress. Here we got a situation where there can be many sick companies. Many will find it difficult to pay their loans. Many will find it difficult to pay their salaries. Many will find it difficult to have sales, which means there will be many people who might default on their rental, on their salaries, on their electricity bills, on their other services. So it's going to be a kind of a situation where there can be several things that will happen together, which can put pressure. That will be true with the country as well. Country also needs a little space. That's why if you think about it, before we start on the COVID fund, I also proposed that we should talk to, not only just by ourselves, but with other countries as well, those emerging countries, and there are plenty of them, below the $100 billion GDP mark kind of thing. Here we go and talk to the IMF and the World Bank and say they have been set up to bring stability to the economies of the world. They have been set up to rebuild nations that are struck by war or some major upheaval. So this is a situation where it can be construed as such. So we would say, give us a break for at least 1 or 2 years, which means that the countries that would have had to pay that money to those institutions, and those institutions are today strong institutions, they can take it and they can also talk to their advanced countries and have some funding coming in, because it has to be of some meaningful assistance, meaningful numbers, not just tiny things which will not have any impact on the overall economy. Sri Lanka is an economy of $85 billion. So $100 billion of a help or assistance or fund is not going to make any dent in the macro level of the country. So it has to be of something significant, maybe $1 billion or $2 billion. And that can come from institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, and we need to talk to them about it, in a way where all can get together and talk. Because if many countries fail, the advanced countries also would fail. They also would have serious difficulties in managing their own economies. So it's a situation where we are all in it together. So we got to take some collective decisions, and that is why I think it is necessary for us to talk with the big guys, talk with the global institutions that were set up only for this purpose, and thereafter we would be able to work out a global response. It is a global problem. It is a global problem, and global problems need global resolutions, global responses. And if we were to, first of all, concentrate on that and make sure that these global responses are also having our input, not just the advanced nations or the G7 or the G20 inputs, must have inputs from the emerging nations as well. We got to go and articulate our position. We got to say why it is important that our voices be heard, because when it is heard and when it is given effect to, that is going to benefit the advanced nations as well. And it will mean that the entire world can move out of this situation and move to a situation of greater prosperity, faster, and with greater clarity. So that is an important message that we should carry. The second is our local situations. What do? We will have large number of companies which would struggle. Some of them might default. Some of them might find that they have to retrench. So our unemployment can rise. And many countries we have seen have had that situation when their economies falter. And economies that falter naturally have social upheavals as well thereafter. So we got to ensure that we do the necessary, have the necessary strategies to ensure that that does not happen. So in order to do that, some propose that we should make it easier for the companies to borrow. My view is that if you give more and more loans to the companies and the corporates which are already struggling, or the businesses, the SMEs that are already struggling. We are only postponing the difficult day, and will also make it worse for the banks and the financial institutions that are lending. So it needs to be not a situation where we create more debt and more debt and more debt to get people out of the debt trap. You can do that only if you find that your income is growing, or income is growing faster than your debt. That is the important factor here. But I don't see that happening in the next 2 to 3 years. In the next 2 to 3 years, what I would see happening is that the incomes will remain constant. They won't increase. If they don't increase, then that means you got to have a policy or a tool that will allow these companies to come out of the debt trap. So what I suggest is we create a large pool of money, a fund, which will have distressed assets funds coming in, or asset management companies, as well as others, including the banks, who will take a view that their own banks are going to be protected with a fund of this nature. And they would provide equity capital to these institutions that are today at the threshold of their debt capacity. That means we relieve them of their debt. And part of the debt is going to be retired with the funding that would come from the equity side of their balance sheet. So this new fund provides them with funds to pay off some part of the debt, as well as have working capital, which means that they will be on the road to recovery much, much faster. And that is the only way that I think they could make it work. In the US, immediately after the global recession, they brought in what was known as the TARP, the Troubled Assets Revival Program. In Malaysia, after the Asian crisis, they brought in what is known as Dhanharta, where they also set up a fund which actually helped the banks to relieve themselves of some of the doubtful debts, which made those companies also have a specialized attention being provided to them, and that worked very well. So it has to be administered, because it's a kind of a venture capital, kind of a capital that could be provided. It has to be administered by people who have a venture capital attitude, a venture capital frame of mind, and the need to ensure that the capital is brought in to the company, for which, of course, they will have ownership of a certain percentage for a short period of time. And we also need to make sure that there's exit for them after a period, maybe 4 years or 5 years down the line, like what happened in the US. And most of those funds exit with a big profit as well. So you come in at a time when there is a crisis, you put money down. Some part of the money will make enormous profits. Some may not be that much of profits. Some may just break even. Some may even make losses. But overall, there would be a good return for those companies as well. And that would be the way that the companies can once again move forward. So I think we need to do that as well. The third proposal that I did was more from a point of view of the public, because you know there'll be thousands and thousands and thousands of people who would be having less incomes, some without income. And I think this would be the best time for them to get a return from their EPF. Many countries have now followed what I have been saying. Some people thought it was not a very great idea, but I think it's not a question of being a great idea or a not so great idea. It's a question of the particular situation that we are in. If a person is having his debt up to his head, and he's unable to make ends meet, and he's on the threshold of losing his job, you need to give him some support. You need to give him some hope and some confidence. And that, I would think, is the way that we should look at it. A 20% return of your superannuation or the EPF would help at that particular time for them to move forward. And some who want to do some business can do it. And it's up to us to make sure that some new robust mechanism is prepared. Because only if we do that, Anushka, we would see that there would be people coming back and demanding goods and services once again. If everybody has no money, what are the companies going to do? What are they going to do? Where will there be economic activity? So you got to ensure that the chicken and the egg are both protected. There must be economic activity. There must be ways in which we could make it work. And that's how you need to look at it. And I think we would need to see it from all angles if we are to make this work for the future. So these are a few ideas that I thought I will share with the public. These would need actually some element of discussion. It would need tweaking. Several countries have already started on some of those points that I have already mentioned, and they are progressing with it. We also need to take some out of the box kind of decisions now. The olden day beaten track kind of ideas would have worked when things are normal. Things are no longer normal. We also have an additional situation in Sri Lanka where we are just coming out of the Easter Sunday carnage, and that's another major problem that we've had to face. And even so, even with that, we had 3 to 4 years of economic downturn from a high growth as well as high macro fundamentals, a high level of macro fundamentals. We have had that also progressing downward. So it's a tough position. It's a challenging period. And that would need some extraordinary measures, like what the managing director of the IMF has said, Kristalina Georgipia. We need to think out of the box, have some new measures, and we need to support those. And the private sector also will have to come forward, and they are also vulnerable today. And if we can get all of them going together, I think we'll have a way forward which will work for everyone. Thanks, everyone. I thankful to you for giving me this opportunity. It's an interesting forum to share some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think interesting thoughts both at 3 levels, at the global level, macro level, and at the private sector tier enterprise level, and also at the level of consumers. So, Mr. Cabral, I have a few questions, and we're getting a couple on the chat also. So let me follow the same flow that you did, and I have questions on each of those. On the global response, and this is something that I've been thinking, and what we have right now is quite a contrast to the post-global financial crisis period, where we had, the G20 group coming together for the first time, leading a firefight, and there was a lot of global coordination and leadership at the time to tackle the economic stress, which we're not really seeing right now. At least we haven't seen so far, compared to, let's say, the global health coordination response. Already, global economic tensions are running high with the trade wars and so on. So, while we need that kind of global coordination, how confident are you that, the world is going to have that this time around? Because we certainly don't see it, unlike the GFC period.
Of course, Anushka, we are in uncharted territory, and that makes it interesting. It has its challenges. It also has some benefits, in the sense we are having a canvas which is quite free. So I think I already reached out to the IMF as well directly and made sure that these ideas are known. They've had an interesting response, but they also acknowledge that it would need the support of the G20 countries and the G7 especially, and that they are also presently grappling with the disease as well as coming out of the COVID itself. So while they have got this at the back of their mind, or even at the front, I don't know which part, they have to deal with it. So I think realization will dawn that this needs a global approach. I don't think they want to wait till some of the countries get into serious trouble. It's always best that you deal with it before. And I think they will be smart enough to see that something needs to be done fast. And I'm confident that that would also take place. I know there are plenty of talks going on behind the scenes, and those talks are quite interesting. I've had the benefit of being associated with a few of those, and those can lead to solutions which are more global based, as well as making sure that there are countries that are not left behind, or groups that are behind, particularly emerging nations, because they are all important today. So I'm pretty confident that there would be a global approach.
Moving on to the enterprise level session, which is this COVID equity fund. So I have a few questions anchored to your proposal. So maybe I'll bunch it together, and also we have a few questions on the chat posed to me, which broadly are along these lines also. So the first is on the prospect of attracting investors. I think you mentioned TARP, and if I'm not mistaken, a big part of that was funded by the government. But I think
Fed Reserve.
your proposal, you want to attract private sector investors as well. So Sri Lanka hasn't really received foreign fund inflows to equity of anything close to this size that you're proposing in the last few years. And I think some of the largest ones recently were Holcim, Allianz, and so on. So it's a large fund, or many small funds coming in, perhaps. The second aspect is already globally investors are going risk off. They are already averse to frontier markets. Do you think we can buck that trend, or how soon do you think we can actually get some interest going? And also, our stock market has been closed for an unprecedented 7 weeks, which may concern investors about exit. So, so I guess this first part, sorry to bunch a few questions together, is on this overall idea of how likely is it that we're going to be able to attract investors. The second question is, after raising the money to deploying and managing the money, we have a few questions like, is it going into listed companies? Is it privately held companies? Is it mainly SME sector or large enterprises? Could you give us maybe more time is needed to flesh it out, fair enough. But, in your thinking, could you give us a peek under the hood and give us a sense of the mechanics of this engine or this vehicle?
Yeah. I think under any circumstances, if you market it properly, you can market it. If you remember the first sovereign bond that we did in Sri Lanka, that was in 2008. We were in the midst of a war. We had a global financial crisis knocking on the door all over the world. Banks were struggling, and we yet went into the markets, and we were able to have a bond that was 5 times or 6 times oversubscribed when we went for $500 million. Lots of people said it's not possible. Lots of people said, no way can you get this. In fact, some of the members of the opposition were saying, we won't even pay it back if it is going to be raised. So it's a matter of going in the right direction, working on it, and presenting it. I think if we work this out right, we would also be able to show enormous opportunities in a fund of this nature. As you quite rightly mentioned, if the government underwrites it and makes sure that there is support for it, there would be many funds who will probably come. Even in the worst of times, you find there are investors. But today, when you say that the stock market is closed, I personally think it would be not very proper to close it for long periods of time. We have to keep these open. Even in the worst of times, when there was an exodus of investment from Sri Lanka immediately after the global crisis hit, we allowed people to take the money out, because by doing so, we were able to provide the confidence that when it's proper for them to come back, they will come back. And we had the investors coming back 2 to 3-fold within a few weeks after they left with the money. So it's a question of marketing it right, getting your overall messaging right. And I think if we work it properly, we would be able to get the funds. That's number one. And I think what we are aiming for is about $750 million in today's day and age. If you market it right, I think it's a very manageable number. And we, of course, need to do it properly. We need to have the proper partners coming in to help us to move it forward. We need to ensure that our messaging is right. We need to get all that parts ready. And then if we do that, I think we can get it going. Number two is about what kind of companies do we sell it to? What are the companies as well as corporates that would take this money? I am looking at it more from the point of view of the macro need. If we can get 150 billion rupees to come into the country, $150 million, I'm not too fussy about where it comes exactly. Companies themselves will also have to provide the necessary platform to receive funds. As you know, any investment, if somebody, you mentioned a few names just now, it means that those companies also have to do their homework. They must provide the vehicle for that entry of those funds. And we will need to nurture them also to be able to receive that. And we also need to nurture some of the smaller companies. Actually, I had a call recently from some of the big funds, and I said, we don't need to look at the big companies only. There are $100 million companies in Sri Lanka, plenty of them, who will find it difficult right now to raise capital. But if you were to come and provide them with $15, $20 million capital to each of those companies, they will probably be able to move to the next stage. They will have confidence to go through. They will have technical inputs coming into their companies. They will have the necessary markets opening out. So that will be a double effect that we would have. One is where they will have the necessary funds coming in so that they become bankable once again. The other is that they would be able to enjoy the benefits of the next stage of development. So I think those are matters that once we set up a good board for this equity fund, they would be able to also decide. They would be able to provide the necessary background to those companies. And maybe I'm looking at 300 to 400 companies, some big, some not very big, but all will have hope, so that the banks also will find that some of the monies that they have presently got locked in companies which are struggling to repay is also released, and they become bankable. The banks become more liquid, and then we have that entire release of the lockdown as far as the economy is concerned. We have not only experienced a lockdown in the people and the lockdown of the country from the point of view of them going forward in a medical sense. There is a lockdown in the economy as well. So we need to release that. We need to make sure that that lockdown is removed so that people can go about freely. And I think given some space, that would happen. And I'm quite confident that we would see many people to come in, which will help the economy as well as the country enormously.
Could you give us a sense of the kind of timeline you're expecting or you envisage in terms of establishment and structuring of the fund, attracting investors, and then starting to deploy the money as equity into companies?
I think for any investor to come in, we must have a country which has a mandate of the government as well as people to be in a position to say this government is going to go a new period. That's why I personally believe that it's necessary for us to have the election done and over with, because no investor in this particular period of time is like how we call it in Sinhala, the Nonagate period, where you don't really take decisions, you just wait. So we have a double Nonagate. One is where we have the COVID situation, where people are generally reluctant to go out, as you quite rightly mentioned. Then we also have a period where there is no proper government in place, where there is no clarity. So we need to bring clarity as quickly as possible. So investors, will never come in unless there is some clarity. So we need to get clarity on our macro fundamentals. We need to get clarity on our governance, whichever the government, it doesn't matter. But there must be clarity of government to deal with the economic issues that will occur in time to come. And we can envisage those. And that's why I think it's important for us to have an election, to have a government in place, whichever the government it is. And that government will then be mandated with the need to take the economy forward. So maybe they might do a COVID fund, they may not, they may have some other plan. But whichever the plan, as you quite rightly mentioned, Anushka, it needs the support of investors who will need to see clarity. So that's why I think all our timelines will be based on the day that we hold the election and then go forward. And whatever that date may be, I think all these things will start clicking and will start to tick from that day onwards. But I think once that is there, we'll probably see a period of about 3 to 6 months if you work fast and hard and smart to get it going. And I think that will also need extraordinary effort. It's not going to be easy. It will need extraordinary effort. It will need the support of lots of people to come in. And I would give ourselves a 6 months period during which time these can be done. And that can be the turnaround. That can be the turnaround of the economy. which we will need to see very, very quickly.
Okay, so two questions from the audience before we need to close. I think we're running a little over time. The first also mirrors a question that I had as well. You know, this fund, as you rightly mentioned, has to be at a time when, you know, investors are willing to come, and, you know, it'll take time to structure it well and credibly, and then start deploying the money. It's the natural course of things. In the interim, and this goes to the third level or layer that you talked about, you know, can this really be an alternative to providing immediate cash flow relief for paying salaries, informal sector workers, including in tourism? Obviously it's not a direct alternative, but what is the solution we have right now to do this? Or is it just that we can't expect this to be done because Sri Lanka doesn't have the fiscal space for that kind of direct cash stimulus that perhaps some other countries are doing? So it's more about helping folks keep their head above water during this time where the immediate effects are being felt. Is there any prospect at all for any direct stimulus like what other countries are doing, or it's just not the situation we have the luxury of doing?
I think it's a very important factor to keep heads above water, whichever way we look at it. If there are millions of people struggling, there is a necessity to keep their heads above water. And whatever we do to keep their heads above water is essential. Those who are a lot more, those who have a lot more money may not think of it in those lines. But those who are struggling, those who have a credit card bill which is at the optimum and they cannot go any further, their doors are being knocked daily for people coming and asking for the money back. There are lots of people like that. So those need to also be addressed, that kind of problem. And that's quite a serious problem. But at the same time, it's not only that. We need to have demand created within the country. Otherwise, none of the companies that are going to be resurrected or revived can also revive themselves. Because where is the demand coming from? If you put up a hotel and there's nobody at the hotel, or you put up a bakery and nobody to buy your bread, or you do a corner store which has no customers. So all these are factors that need to be looked at. So therefore, demand has to be created. And from the point of view of the people who are also they have to make sure that they are also alive and kicking. Government needs to also provide some space. And that's why I think fiscally, there will be a strain on the budget. As you quite rightly mentioned, some countries have sent out checks to everyone. And all taxpayers have got refunds. So there are various new methods which were extraordinary that would need to be done. Then also there may be a need to have some work be created within the country. That means have some new projects going so that those projects will also attract investment as well as money will flow through those projects as well. So it's a very collective kind of approach that we should look at, not just one thing only. Now, each of these may appear to be separate strategies, but these are all interconnected. As you know, in economics, these are all married together, and one has an impact on the other and the other on the next one. So in that sense, I think all these need to be done together. And whilst doing it, there will be challenges that will occur at each level. Those need to be addressed. And we got to start. That is what is important. If we don't start, we will not be able to move forward. And I would think that the government will have to give the start, but thereafter some private funds will have to be created, and that also needs to be given a start if we are to move forward.
In the spirit of government giving the start, we have a question from one of the fellows. Some countries are seriously considering universal basic income. How might this work in Sri Lanka? What are your views on that?
You see, right now, some of the niceties may have to also get postponed, because right now we are in a situation where we have to get over the crisis situation, and that would have a priorities list that will need to be slightly different from the norm. Once you have the urgent priorities worked out and the urgent matters dealt with, then we can move into the next stage of the other areas that need to be looked at as well. I'm fully with you on that those have to be also addressed. But I think right now we are seeing a priority list which is important for us to recognize, and those priorities have to be done. The vulnerable people have to be provided with the relief. The companies which are struggling need to be provided with the space. The big companies that will need to ensure that they give leadership to the rest of the economy to move forward need to be also propped up to some extent. The banks need to be protected as well as made sure that they have sufficient funding and their liquidity levels are looked after. So these are all critical issues that we need to address, and that's going to be the formula that any economic planner will have to be looking at.
Two questions coming around manufacturing. One is, can we attract some industries moving out of China? So I guess this is anchored to this idea that supply chains are going to be upended, redrawn, recalibrated, maybe shortening, regionalizing, and lots of companies are looking to kind of de-risk their supply chain. So the question is, can we attract some industries moving out of China, maybe in manufacturing? A different angle to this manufacturing question has come from Heminder. We saw few imports being stopped. Not sure whether this is long or short-term strategy. Any government support plan for local manufacturers to get into this area? So I guess two different aspects, but of this industry and manufacturing question.
Very interesting questions. Both are very interesting questions. Thank you for those. The first one is, I wouldn't like to see a situation where we target companies which are moving out of a particular country to come into our country. I don't think that's the way we should approach it. But if there are any companies, any corporations that we like to come into Sri Lanka and we provide the space to them, we make sure that we give them a platform and they want to come in here, well, they'll be welcome to do that. But I think we shouldn't be approaching it from trying to get a particular group of companies which are moving out from a particular country to come into our country in a specialized manner. I wouldn't want to see that happening, but opening it out, making sure that whoever who wishes to come from any place can come in is the way that I think we should work that out. And if we do it that way, we'll probably make sure that we have an open system which will allow people to come in. The second part is, yes, we are seeing a short-term situation where we are seeing an acute reduction in the monies coming into the country from abroad, and that's a tough call in a certain period of time. I don't envy the central bank governor as well as his team right now, because it's a tough position to deal with. Therefore, I think they've taken some extraordinary measures in curbing imports of a large number of items, which I would think is not going to be any permanent situation, but it would be a kind of a situation where they can provide some relief to the rupee and not ensure that and also ensure that the rupee stays at a certain reasonable level. So I would think that it is short-term measure, which has been done in order to protect the rupee as well as ensure that the reserves are maintained at a certain level at least. So we would see a change once things improve, and let's hope that we can get to that situation as fast as possible. And to do that, we need to have normalcy. We need to, as not the normal normalcy that we were talking about, but a new normalcy perhaps. It can be different, but still we need to have some certainty about how we go about our post-COVID period, so that people have some kind of clarity. That's why I've been talking several times about clarity. We need to have clarity in government. We need to have clarity in the environment. Right now, there's a lot of dust in the air. There's a lot of dust all over the world. People don't know exactly what's taking shape, what's the new type of stuff that would be demanded. So that dust has to settle to some extent. And let's see how this goes. I think the next 2 months will be critical and crucial from both from a global point of view as well as from a local point of view. We will have several things that need to take place in those 2 months. And if that happens, I think we'll be on our way to recovery, and that's going to be a pretty challenging period. And let's hope we can get those factors right in order to move it forward.
Okay, last is going to combine two. Uh, and this is Dayananda has asked, what is the position in 2020? And then another participant has asked, what are the chances of us defaulting on the bonds? So I guess if you can give the audience a sense of your take on 2020 growth, growth outlook, and very specifically on this question on defaulting on the bonds, and then we can wrap up there.
Sri Lanka has come to a difficult period right after 2019. If you see the annual report of 2019 of the central bank, we have seen a fairly clear decline in growth, as well as a clearly we have all our macro fundamentals have been clearly damaged. So it's a tough call. But at the same time, Sri Lanka has been a resilient country as well. So I still have hope for Sri Lanka going forward. But in the year 2020, with the impact of the COVID, as well as the lingering impacts of the Easter Sunday carnage, as well as the downturn in the last 4 to 5 years, I would think that it's not going to be a great year. It's going to be a year which is fraught with a lot of challenges. Already nearly 2/3 of it is gone. Actually, 2/3 of the year is gone. Sorry, 1/3 of the year is gone. 2/3 is left. But out of the 2/3 also, I don't think we can expect much to happen. 1/3 would perhaps be the period that we would see some real impact of new decision making taking place. So I would think that if we can maintain at least our level of last year, we would do well. That means if we can maintain a zero growth, we would do well. If we can eke out 1.5% as a positive growth, it would be extraordinary benefit that we should really strive for. But the chances are that we would see growth getting dampened, and other macro fundamentals which are damaged will need to be nurtured back gently. And I see that as a very, very challenging year. So 2020 is a tough year, but I would think that if we approach it right and we get some of the chords into place and some of the international areas are carefully nurtured, we would be able to see Sri Lanka going forward. The second question that you asked was with regard to, sorry, you would like to repeat that?
Yes, the second question was specific. What are the chances of us defaulting on the bonds?
Yes, I would think that the reserves that Sri Lanka presently has in its reserves are quite comfortable to be able to pay off the bonds which are maturing in October. There is plenty of foreign exchange that is available for that. One of the challenges would be to find the rupees in order for the foreign exchange to be got. And that's going to be one of the major challenges, because the foreign exchange is available in the central bank. But the government will have to have rupees in order to purchase the foreign exchange from the central bank. And that, I think, is going to be one of the key challenges going in for the future. So having said that, I would think that there could be an improvement in the revenues as time goes on. And hopefully the rupees will take place and we don't need to have too much of attention on that. But the foreign exchange is available, and I would say therefore that we would have a zero chance of the October bond being defaulted, and quite confident that that would be met by the government in the time that is needed for it to be met.